Hello there. Welcome to Amandla Conversation. And my name is Ayotomiwa Ayodele. On this platform, we bring in experts from different fields to educate us and to speak to us about various topics. And today, we're having a woman of, let me use the word timber and caliber in the room to talk to us. And I'm talking about Miss Fabia Ogunmekan. Welcome to Amandla Conversation.
Nice to be there.
Same here. Nice to have you here. So, a short bio about her. Well, she's a lawyer and gender and development consultant whose work is at the intersection of law, policy, advocacy, and programming within the development sector. She is the principal consultant of Adaba Initiative. So, when I said a woman of timber and caliber, now you know what I mean. Well, now let's begin. We're talking, and today you'll be speaking to us about network resource, mobilization, and movement scale up. Yes, because many people do things around, oh, I'm working, but then many people are not networking. And then talking about resources, how do you pull resources together? So these and many more is what you'll be talking about on this conversation and this platform. So let's begin, Ms. Fabia. Now, what are the key barriers preventing women's movements from effectively scaling beyond isolated initiatives and at the same time into coordinated national and regional ecosystems? Because usually when you hear the stories, you wonder like, okay, what are the big issues here?
Okay, so thanks for having me on the conversations once again. So in the first place, what are women's networks and why are they important? And I think you hit on the points when you asked the question about isolated interventions, right? So the whole idea is that while my initiative and your initiative can do independent things, we are stronger together, right? And this conversation is situated within the women's movement, within the whole idea of us all being interested in advocating for gender equality, gender equity, and all that comes with that. Women's rights and justice, women's economic power, women's political power, right? So there are many issues when we talk about gender equality and when we talk about what everyone is doing, and all the different organizations within the space may have specific interests, some may be broad, but then there's that one thing that brings us all together, which is the push for gender equality and women's economic empowerment and political empowerment and rights and justice, etc., under the broad umbrella of gender equality. And so that's why it's necessary to be able to come together in these coalitions and networks, that we talk about. And because the benefits of coming together, obviously, is that there's the African proverb that says if you want to go fast, go alone. Is it? If you want to go far, go together. And we know the struggles. We know where we've come from. We know that we haven't reached where we would like to be across all of these issue subjects that I've spoken about. And so it's stronger, obviously, when we work together. And we have lots of examples. The women's movements has dates back, and we've been in conversations and in spaces over the last couple of days that have really showed what the history is of the women's movement in Nigeria, and how what the history is, what they've been able to achieve, what the gaps are, and all of that in terms of the work. So we know that a lot has been achieved, but there's still quite a ways to go. But why perhaps haven't we
The barriers.
reached those goals, right? In the drive. I don't want to. So I would call it a barrier, and I'm not saying that that's like it's not happening. It's just that it can be better, right? So one is definitely shared vision, right? The idea, and I've spoken around. Oh, a lot of us coalesce around the issues of gender, but then you see that itself is so broad that if a movement is to succeed, you have to be very specific about what it is that we are going for. Sometimes it has to be issue specific to a time, to a cause, and to a specific matter. Sometimes, it just continues because it's a broad range of issues. Or whatever it is, needs to have a shared vision. The vision needs to be clear. The vision needs to be articulated. What is it that we are pushing for? What is it that we're trying to achieve? What does success look like? All of that needs to be clear. What are the tactics that we're going to use to be able to achieve those goals? what are the strategies? All of that needs to be clear. Who are the members of this coalition? Governance also becomes, it's very important. So I'm flipping the barriers into what needs to happen, right? So in the same way that there are barriers, if we get them right, they become success factors. So a clear governance structure is also important. So number one is a shared vision. Number two is a clear governance structure. Who is running this network, right? Who are the leaders of this network? Is it a system where it's just one, two, three people leading the network, or is there a system of co-leadership designed into the framework? I think the best movements are those that have a level of co-leadership that carry everybody along. And that's even another point as well. The fact that there will be so many diverse interests within networks, which is why this going back to the idea of the shared vision and reminding and constantly reiterating and making sure that all those who are members of this network are clear on what the vision is, because there'll be diverse interests, and also then being able to bring those diverse interests and taking, we talk about intersectionality, so taking the various interests of the various members who are in the network into consideration is also important. And then finally, the right infrastructure. So shared vision, governance, and having the right infrastructure, resourcing, knowledge systems, data, information, evidence. You can't run a network without all of these things, right? People don't know and don't have the supporting tools to be able to do the work. It will fail. If people don't have the money, right, to be able to back the network, it will fail, or it will not be sustained, right? So having systems and infrastructures in place that ensure that resourcing continues and the right architecture and framework is there to support the movement. So I think I will stop there.
All right, now let me pick it up from where you stopped.
Yes.
We're talking about resources.
Yes.
And then that brings me to ask that how can feminist networks strengthen resource mobilization in ways that actually reduce dependency while increasing sustainability and autonomy? You talk about shared vision, infrastructure, and all of that. Yes. So that's why I'm picking it from where you stop now, since we're talking about resource. So let's look at it. So how can the feminist network? Okay, yes, we have a shared vision. We're coming together. I'm doing mine in my own space. You're doing yours, but we're coming together. So how can we, as this network, now come together to strengthen mobilization, resource mobilization specifically?
Okay, so that's fine. And of course, resource mobilization is one of the biggest, could be the biggest barrier amongst the other things that I've spoken about. Right. So there are different ways in which one mobilizes resources, and for a lot of times in our own parts of the world, networks like this, networks, coalitions, I use those two terms loosely, would often rely on donor-dependent funds, and lots of times the majority of those funds that support these sorts of networks are donor dependent, and and it kind of makes sense that we would look to donors for those types of international funding organizations, because um, obviously movements and coalitions are non-governmental organizations, and so you wouldn't be receiving funding for your cause, which you're usually fighting, or trying to ask government to take action by receiving funds from the government. So you would be looking to other sources of funding. And largely, those that can fund and really mobilize such movements are international regional organizations. But then the dependency on those types of funding, and where we are in terms of global funding and all of that, can often, sometimes stall, or there may be restrictions attached to those types of funding. So it means that for networks to be effectively funded, you need to look at a diverse pool and diverse, resource mobilization opportunities and platforms, right? So sourcing from, the typical grants and those sorts of things are there, but looking at, non-traditional donors like, the corporate philanthropies, individual philanthropies, and all of those, other ways in which civil society raises money. And then the other is obviously within the membership itself, right? Mobilizing resources from within the membership, because remember that these are a network of organizations who have come together to be able to feel advocate for a particular cause. And so each of them also come with some level of, and resources is not just limited to money. It's also, knowledge capacity. It's also technology. It's also human resources as well. So, And that goes back again to structure and infrastructure, right? So having a clear, which is why it's important from the very beginning to have a clear governance sort of structure in place that says, okay, how are we going to, do this? Who's going to bring what resource? Who's going to bring what in terms of funding? Where are we going to get funding from? So having all of this properly articulated, will be very important. So, yeah, so I think it's one, diversification of where the funding comes from, having a proper structure and system to be able to govern and keep accountable, because that's also another problem. When there is no accountability of how funds are received or are being used, that can often lead to breakdown in communication, in problems and conflicts. And then, of course, having within that infrastructure conflict management systems as well, conflict resolution systems as well. So it's quite broad, but I think the key points is having a diverse diverse ways in which you can raise funding, having that clearly articulated within a proper governance structure, ensuring that there are accountability mechanisms that are tied to that, and having, as if possible, sort of a long-term plan in terms of how those resources will continue to be mobilized. If it's donors, if it's grants, it should be like as long as possible, multi-year, unrestricted. If it's membership, should be obviously continuous and annual, and just having a proper accountability system.
That's accountability system. It's actually very, very critical because since it's a movement that's a pool of many individuals' resources, human resource and network and all that. Yes, I agree. Accountability. All right. We're talking about shared vision, diversification of resources, like you mentioned earlier. So I'm picking it up from there now. Now, what's collaboration? Because if you have different or diverse interests, diverse expert human resource to pull from. So what's collaboration model between grassroots actors, donors, and institutions? You mentioned governance structure earlier as proving most effective for long-term movement building.
Okay, models. So I can give an example of one institution I think has done, it's an institution, but then it's done movement building, very well, which is the African Women's Development Fund. Incidentally, that was co-founded by Eredibusi Adaba, also now co-founder of the Amandla Institute. What the organization was able to do was be the interconnector between donors, between grassroots organizations, and yes, so in playing that role of an intermediary. Now that's just one example. And why that worked well was that in a way, AWDF, wasn't an umbrella organization, in the sense of the networks that we're talking about. But just being able to play that intermediary role is, one sort of example of how networks can sort of tap into that, because the grassroots organizations in some ways that benefited from that support from the African Women's Development Fund were networked in a certain way. And what AWTF did very well was to strengthen them, build their capacity, build a level of trust. So it wasn't just a typical grantee donor relationship. It was really almost like a collaboration and partnership. We're working with you on the causes that you're promoting around this shared vision. We will support you to build your capacity. We will support your organization itself in terms of institutional strengthening, and we will bring you together bring you together in a network to be able to learn and share from each other. So that works very well. And I think that the role that Amandla is also playing now in strengthening the women's movements is also another sort of model. Of course, you have coalitions like the Women Manifesto movement as well, which is another kind of model, loose network of various organizations, strong organizations, independent organizations on their own, who are coming together to, advocate very, very strongly for a lot of, causes that affect women in Nigeria, including gender-based violence, including, women's political participation, and a host of other things. Now, what makes some of these models work, and what can improve, what can we do to sort of improve on those models, because then, they're not all, they're not perfect. Everyone, these movements can continue to evolve and learn and be better. Net of infrastructure is very important. That's, having, what is it that connects us, what is it that connects us? What is the infrastructure that keeps us all in the space and keeps us informed? Because information is very important. So sometimes, now we're in the digital world, so we have digital platforms that keep us connected. That's very important, so that information and communication keeps flowing. Where communication breaks down, that's where you begin to see a lot of problems and where people lose sight of what's important. So I've spoken before about strong governance systems. So that's also very important. Trust, building trust building in these networks. You can't, I can't overemphasize how important that, those trust mechanisms are. So how do we continuously build trust? How is trust built into the architecture of the movement? That's very important. What are the different roles and obligations of members within that movement? So that's, because again, we're all working towards gender equality, but what are you doing and what am I doing? How can we, so that we're not also necessarily duplicating efforts, right? So how can we sort of create that platform where everyone knows what everyone is doing? We can lean on each other to, amplify, or people have specific roles and, those roles are clear. A strong center is not, I think sometimes can be a barrier where the leadership is too strong and people don't feel like they have voice and agency. So some level of decentralization, while still within that structure of we understand the governance system. I think the most important thing is that there is a governance system that is known, that is bought into, and that people that keeps people accountable. That's more important than a very strong center. So some form of the decentralized system that gives everybody voice, I think, is important. And of course, continuous capacity strengthening of these, continuous knowledge sharing, continuous opportunities to build, continuous opportunities to refresh knowledge, understand what's happening in the ecosystem, and through mechanisms of like regular meetings, capacity building opportunities, retreats, because self-care, this is also very important. And that's also the reason why you need to have where that governance structure has, is very important, because if you only have a few people leading, when they get tired, when they get distracted or when they get burnt out, what happens? And you find that the movement just, begins to, lose inertia. So having, multiple layers of leadership, intergenerational, strengthening, within the movements, very important within the network. And of course, yeah, I've spoken about all the other things, resourcing and all. So, yeah, I think the opportunities are there. Um, we are doing a lot of great work. Um, we already have, I've mentioned some models, and there are many more. We have, movements like the NSARS, who for the time that they existed was very well organized, youth led, youth driven. Um, the structure was there, the funding mechanism was there, and it achieved what it sought to achieve for the peers. So we had lots of examples.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, as we wrap up this segment of this conversation, your final word about resource mobilization, networking, and collaboration to strengthen women's movements.
I think that all of those things are critical, for the women's movement, right? You can't have an effective women's movement if you don't have the right governance structures, if you don't have the right resourcing that is long term sustainable, because the causes that we fight for are long term, right? Um, and the passion, the shared vision needs to continue to be there. The fact that, also um, understanding the diverse interests as well, and certainly making it an intergenerational platform, I think is very important in the conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Miss Fabia Ogunmekan, for speaking to us so
Thank
far.
you, Ayotomiwa.
And yes, that's it on this segment. And this is where we shall be wrapping up. And I hope you've learned a thing or two. And it's Amandla Conversation. My name is Ayotomiwa Ayodele. I've been speaking to Miss Fabia Ogunmekan, who is a lawyer and gender and development consultant. And she's the principal partner consultant rather at Adaba Initiatives. We say thank you so much once again
Thank
for
you.
coming, and hopefully we have you here again to talk about something
sure.
else.
I'm sure.
And
I'd love
until
to.
another time again, we'll come with another topic, and just keep listening to Amandla Conversation. Thank you for your time, my dear audience, and see you some other time. Bye.
Thank you.